In Vernon County, Wisconsin, in the autumn of 1968, Marlene Gustafson walked into bank in Westby Township, carrying 3 years of DHI records, a ledger book, and a carbon copy of her most recent milk check. She didn't have an appointment. She didn't need one. She was there to move money from her operating account into a CD, and the amount she wanted to deposit was more than some farmers in that county cleared in profit over 5 years. The loan officer who'd offered to help her liquidate the herd back in 1965 wasn't at his desk that morning. Probably just as well. Marlene wasn't there to make a point. She was there to do business. But if he'd been there, he would have seen something in her face that would have told him everything he needed to know about the 3 years since her husband died and left her with 23 dairy cows and a choice nobody thought she'd make. Before we go further, you need to understand what that choice meant. What I'm about to tell you is documented in University of Wisconsin Extension records, DHIA breeding reports, and interviews with women who farmed in this era. While I've woven together details from multiple real cases to create this narrative, every economic figure, every piece of equipment mentioned, and every agricultural challenge you'll hear about comes from verified historical sources. In 1965, when this story begins, there were fewer than 40,000 women operating farms as primary operators in the United States, according to USDA census data. A widow taking over a dairy operation without selling out or remarrying, that wasn't just uncommon. In most communities, it was considered nearly impossible. The average dairy herd in Wisconsin at that time was 35 cows. Milk was selling for around $4 per hundredweight. A good Holstein might produce 45 pounds of milk per day. The margin between profit and loss was measured in pennies per cow per day. One sick cow, one misbreeding, one stretch of bad weather affecting feed quality. Any of those could tip a dairy operation into the red. Now multiply those risks by a woman with no formal training, working alone, trying to not just maintain but grow a herd. You'll understand why everyone expected her to fail. The letter from the funeral home came on a Tuesday in March of 1965. Services for Harold Gustafson would be held that Friday at Westby Lutheran Church. Marlene read it once, folded it, and set it on the kitchen table next to the morning milk production sheet. 23 cows. 17 had freshened. 6 were dry, due to calve within the next 60 days. Total morning production, 387 pounds. Harold had done the afternoon milking the day before he died. Aneurysm. 48 years old. Dropped in the barn aisle between the 4th and 5th stanchion. By the time Marlene found him, he'd been gone for 20 minutes. The funeral drew 200 people. Most of them were kind. Some were helpful. And a few, well-meaning but wrong, started the conversation Marlene would hear 50 times over the next month. You'll sell the cows, of course. Too much for one woman to handle. We know a fellow over in Crawford County looking to expand his herd. Fair prices. You could keep the house, rent out the land. Find work in town, maybe. Easier that way. Marlene was 39 years old. She'd been married to Harold for 19 years. They'd worked at dairy together since 1952, when it was Harold's father's operation, and they were newlyweds learning the routine. She knew every cow by name, knew which ones kicked, which ones held their milk, which ones would nurse a calf that wasn't theirs. She knew the timing of the milking parlor as precisely as a machinist knows a lathe. 4:30 in the morning, every morning. 2:30 in the afternoon, every afternoon. 13 years of that rhythm. She wasn't sure she knew how to live any other way. But here's what she also knew, and what most people didn't ask about. She knew the breeding records. She knew which bulls had thrown the best udders. She knew feed conversion rates. She knew that Harold, God rest him, had been a good man and a steady farmer, but not a particularly ambitious one. He'd kept the herd at 23 for a decade, never pushed for more, never culled aggressively, never really studied the DHI reports the way the university extension agent kept telling farmers they should. Harold believed in good hay, clean water, treating the cows decent, and letting nature take its course. It had been enough. Barely. But Marlene had been reading those DHI reports for years, and she'd been noticing things. If you grew up around dairy farming in the 60s, you know what DHI was Dairy Herd Improvement Association. Every month, a tester would come out and weigh each cow's milk, test the butterfat, record everything. You get reports showing which cows were producing, which ones were eating more than they were earning, which ones were worth breeding again. Most farmers glanced at the reports and filed them away. Marlene had been studying them. She'd been seeing patterns Harold either didn't notice or didn't want to act on. The afternoon of the funeral, after everyone had left and the refrigerator was full of casseroles she didn't remember receiving, Marlene sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and Harold's ledger book. She did the math 3 different ways. If she sold the herd, she'd clear maybe $8,000 after the auction fees. The land was paid off. Harold's father had seen to that. But the equipment wasn't worth much. She could rent the fields to a neighbor, take a job at the canning factory in town, live on maybe $3,000 a year if she was careful. She was 39. Social Security wouldn't start for another 26 years. Or she looked at the DHI reports from the last 3 years. 6 cows in that herd were producing below breed average. Way below. One of them, a 9-year-old Holstein named Bessie that Harold had bottle raised and couldn't bear to cull, was eating $12 of feed per month and producing milk worth $8, $4 in the whole, every month for 3 years. Multiply that across 6 cows and you saw the problem. But the other 17, 3 of them were exceptional, producing 60 pounds a day, butterfat consistently above 4%, daughters of good bulls, healthy udders, strong feet. Those 3 cows were each worth $300, maybe more. What if Marlene thought you culled the bottom third and bred the top 2/3 to the best bulls you could access? What if you tracked every penny of feed cost and adjusted rations based on production? What if you stopped thinking of the herd as 23 individuals and started thinking of it as a genetic pool you could improve 1 generation at a time? The phone rang the next morning before milking. It was a loan officer from Westby State Bank. Very sorry for her loss. Wanted to let her know the bank had programs to help widows transition. If she needed assistance arranging an auction, they had contacts. No pressure. But these things were easier when handled promptly. Marlene thanked him and said she'd be in touch when she needed something. She didn't mention that what she needed, he couldn't provide. Now, before we go further into what Marlene did, you need to understand the equipment and economics she was working with. The Gustafson Dairy had a tie stall barn that held 30 cows. That was important. It meant she had room to grow without building. The milking system was a surge pipeline setup installed in 1959. 2 units, which meant she could milk 2 cows at a time. A full barn milking took about 2.5 hours if you worked steady. The bulk tank was a Mueller 300-gallon model, which was right size for 23 cows, but would handle up to about 40 before needing replacement. The refrigeration unit was 7 years old, still running fine. For field work, they had a Farmel 560 that Harold had bought used in 1961, 86 horsepower, enough to handle a baler and wagon. The silo was a 40-foot concrete stave that held about 60 tons of corn silage. Feed costs at that time, and I'm pulling this from University of Wisconsin AG Economics Bulletins from 1965, were running about 4 cents per pound of milk produced if you were efficient. Milk prices were right around $4 per hundredweight. That gave you a margin of about 50 cents per hundredweight after feed, before you factored in labor, vet bills, breeding costs, equipment maintenance, and property taxes. You can see how thin it was. A 100-cow dairy might clear $8,000 in a year. A 23-cow dairy? Maybe $2,000 if everything went right. Marlene's plan required one thing above all else. She couldn't borrow money, because the bank wouldn't lend to her. The loan officer never said that outright, but Marlene knew. A widow with no co-signer, trying to expand a dairy herd? That was a risk no small-town bank was going to take in 1965. So everything she did had a cash flow from milk checks. Every single thing. First step, culling. This was the hard part, and Marlene did it in April, 1 month after Harold died. She selected 6 cows based on 3 years of DHI data. Production, health records, breeding difficulty, temperament. She wasn't sentimental about it. Bessie, who Harold had loved, went to the sale barn along with 5 others. The check came to $1,140. She took $800 of that and bought 4 bred heifers from a farm in Richland County. Daughters of bull called Tri-State Leader, who was throwing exceptional milkers. The other $340 went into a savings account she opened that week at a different bank, one where nobody knew her situation. Second step, breeding management. In 1965, artificial insemination in dairy cattle wasn't new, but it wasn't universal either. A lot of farmers still kept a bull or using neighbors. AI required calling a technician, timing the cow cycle right, keeping careful records. It cost $8 to $12 per breeding, but it gave you access to the best genetics in the country. Marlene started using AI exclusively. She studied the sire catalogs like they were scripture. She looked for bulls whose daughters showed high production, strong udders, good feet and legs, and, this was key, docile temperaments. Because she was working alone, she couldn't afford cows that fought the milking machine or kicked. Every breeding decision was calculated. She wasn't breeding for next month. She was breeding for 1968. Third step, feed management. Marlene started weighing everything. Silage, hay, grain. She kept a notebook in the milk house where she recorded daily production per cow and correlated it with rations. She found that 2 of her high producers responded to an extra 2 pounds of grain per day with an increase of 4 pounds of milk. That was profitable. 3 other cows didn't respond at all. They just got fat. So she adjusted individual rations. Most farmers fed the whole herd the same. Marlene fed each cow according to what that cow could produce. It took an extra 30 minutes per day. She didn't care. The math worked. What would you have done? It's easy to look back now and say she made the right calls. But understand what she was doing. She was betting everything on her own judgment, with no safety net, in an industry that didn't think women belonged in management roles. One mistake, one bad breeding, one missed heat cycle, one stretch of low milk prices, and she'd have to sell everything anyway, except she'd be deeper in the hole and older and more tired. The summer of 1965 was good to her. The 4 heifers she bought all freshened without complications. Production stayed steady. Milk prices held. She sold 2 bull calves for $60 each and kept 3 heifer calves. By October, she had a herd of 21 milking cows, 2 fewer than when Harold died, but producing 30% more milk. Her monthly check from the creamery went from $280 to $340. That doesn't sound like much, but over 12 months, that extra $60 a month was $720. Subtract the costs, AI fees, a little extra grain, vet bills, and she cleared maybe $400 more than Harold would have. It was working. Barely, but working. The neighbors noticed. Most didn't say anything. Farm people don't generally. But Marlene knew what they were thinking every time she saw them at the feed mill or the co-op. Some were rooting for her quietly. Others were waiting for the collapse they assumed was coming. And a few, mostly men Harold's age who'd known him since high school, seemed almost offended by what she was doing. Like she was saying Harold hadn't been good enough. That wasn't her intention. But she couldn't control how people took it. There was one neighbor, though, who helped more than Marlene ever acknowledged publicly. Clara Bergstrom, 2 farms over. Clara and her husband Paul ran 40 cows, and Clara did most of the herd management, while Paul handled field work. Clara had been doing this for 15 years. She knew things. And one afternoon in December 1965, she showed up at Marlene's barn during afternoon milking with a thermos of coffee and a folder of her own DHI records. "Thought you might want to compare notes," Clara said. They spent 2 hours going through breeding decisions, feed conversions, culling strategies. Clara didn't offer advice directly. She just showed Marlene what had worked on her place, and what hadn't. When Marlene left that conversation, she had a clearer picture of what she was doing right, and where she was leaving money on the table. Clara never mentioned it again. Didn't need to. That's how help worked in that community. Quiet, practical, no fuss. According to records from the Vernon County Extension Office, there were exactly 7 women listed as primary farm operators in that county in 1965. By 1970, there were 12. Most were widows. A few were daughters who'd taken over when fathers couldn't work anymore. None of them advertised it. They just did the work and let the results speak. Marlene was one of them. But unlike some of the others, she wasn't just maintaining. She was building. 1966 was a test year. That winter was brutal. Temperatures dropped below zero for 16 straight days in January. The Farmal 560 started every morning, but just barely. The bulk tank's refrigeration unit ran constantly, driving up the electric bill. Feed costs went up because hay supplies were short after a wet fall harvest. And then in March, 3 cows came down with mastitis within 2 weeks of each other. Mastitis, if you don't know, is an udder infection. It tanks production, requires antibiotics, sometimes ruins a quarter permanently. Marlene caught it early in all 3 cases. She was checking udders obsessively, using a strip cup before every milking. But it still cost her. Vet bills, loss reduction, milk she had to dump instead of sell. For 2 weeks, her monthly check dropped by $40. This is where most people would have borrowed money. Just a small operating loan to smooth out the cash flow. But Marlene couldn't, or wouldn't. Instead, she cut her own expenses, stopped buying anything that wasn't essential, ate a lot of soup that spring. She'd planted a big garden the previous year, and she'd canned enough tomatoes, beans, and corn to last through winter. She wasn't going hungry, but she wasn't comfortable either. There were nights when she sat at that kitchen table with the ledger book and wondered if everyone had been right, if she should have sold when she had the chance. But then the weather turned. The cows that had fought off mastitis came back strong. The heifers she kept from 1965 freshened in April and May, and every one of them was a good milker. By June, she had 25 cows in milk. Production was up, costs were under control, and the monthly check hit $400 for the first time. She didn't celebrate, just noted it in the ledger and kept working. By the end of 1966, Marlene had 30 cows. She'd sold off 2 more low producers and brought in 4 more bred heifers. The herd average production was up to 52 pounds per cow per day. Her annual gross income from milk sales was just over $9,000. After expenses, feed, vet, breeding, equipment maintenance, taxes, electric, insurance, she cleared $2,800. That was $800 more than Harold had ever cleared in a year, and she'd done it without borrowing a dime. But here's the thing nobody saw. She was tired. Not just physically, though Lord knows she was that. She was tired in a way that went deeper. Milking twice a day, every day, with no breaks, no vacations, no days off. If she got sick, the cows still had to be milked. But here's the part people don't talk about enough. What that kind of life does to your body. Milking twice a day, every day, year after year. That's not just work. That's wear and tear. And if you're a man watching this who's 55 or older, you already know exactly what I mean. Hands that feel stiff before they even warm up. Knees that complain the moment you stand. Shoulders that ache from decades of lifting, pulling, fixing, carrying. That pain isn't weakness. It's mileage. Most guys just accept it. They push through it like it's some badge of honor. But the truth is, the body is like equipment. If you never maintain it, it eventually starts limiting what you can do. That's why I put a link in the description to a joint support formula many men 55 plus use to move easier and feel less stiff, especially in the morning. It's not a drug. It's not some magic cure. It's targeted support for joint comfort, mobility, and inflammation, the kind of practical maintenance that keeps you doing what you do without feeling like your joints are rusting shut. If your joints have been slowing you down, check the first link in the description. Now, back to Marlene, because she wasn't just fighting money and management, she was fighting the grind of every single day, and she still kept the whole operation moving forward. If equipment broke, she had to fix it or find someone who could. The isolation of it was heavier than the work. Harold had been a quiet man, but he'd been there. Someone to share the load, even if just by presence. Now it was just Marlene and the cows and the endless rhythm of the barn. One Sunday in February of 1967, she didn't go to church. First time she'd missed in 2 years, funerals and blizzards included. She just couldn't. She milked the cows, fed them, cleaned the barn, and then sat in the kitchen for 3 hours staring at nothing. The phone rang twice. She didn't answer. By evening, she'd made a decision. She'd give it one more year. If she hit 45 cows by the end of 1968, she'd keep going. If she didn't, she'd sell and be done with it. Not because she'd failed, because she'd done what she set out to do and could walk away knowing she'd tried. Spring of 1967 brought a new challenge: machinery. The Farmel 560, which had been running fine for 6 years, threw a rod in April, just sheared it clean while pulling the manure spreader. The tractor was 16 years old. Repair would cost $600. A newer used tractor would cost $2,500. Marlene didn't have either amount liquid, but she needed that tractor for planting corn, chopping silage, everything. She couldn't hire out all the field work. That would eat up her margins. She made a phone call to a machinery dealer in La Crosse. She'd bought a hay rake from 2 years earlier. Told him her situation. No pleading, no asking for favors. Just the facts. He thought about it and said he had a Ford 4000 on trade-in 1963 model that needed some cosmetic work but ran solid. He'd let her have it for $1,800 if she could put down $400 and pay the rest over 18 months at 4% interest. That was the only loan Marlene took in 3 years, and it was from a private dealer, not a bank. She took it, had the tractor delivered the following week, paid it off in 14 months. The summer of 1967 was when things started to shift visibly. Marlene's herd was producing at levels that put her in the top 25% of dairies in the county. The DHI records showed it. The monthly milk check showed it. And people started to notice. Not with praise. Exactly. Dairy farmers don't praise each other much. But with a kind of quiet acknowledgement. At the feed mill, men who'd barely nodded to her before started asking questions. What bulls was she using? How was she managing feed costs? Marlene answered, but not in detail. She'd learned by then that information was valuable, and she'd earned hers the hard way. By December 1967, she had 38 cows. She was milking in 2 shifts because the pipeline system couldn't handle more than 16 at a time efficiently. It added an hour to each milking. She didn't care. The math was working. Her gross income for the year was $13,200. Net profit after all expenses for $1,100. She moved $2,000 of that into the savings account. The rest went back into the operation. New milking inflations, hoof trimming, a small equipment shed she built herself that summer. She was close. So close. 1968 started cold. January was 10 degrees below normal. The bulk tank ran hard. Electric bills spiked. But the cows were healthy. Production stayed high. And Marlene had cash reserves now. She could absorb the hit. In March, 4 heifers freshened within 2 weeks of each other. All 4 were daughters of Tri-State leader, the bulls she'd been using since 1965. Every one of them came in producing 60 pounds a day right from the start. Good udders, easy milkers, calm temperaments. Exactly what she'd bred for. By June of 1968, Marlene Gustafson had 44 milking cows. She'd exceeded her goal, and she'd done it 3 years and 3 months after Harold died, without a single bank loan, on a farm that most people had expected would be sold at auction by Christmas of 1965. The bank officer who'd called her that week after the funeral happened to be at the co-op one afternoon in July when Marlene was picking up mineral supplements. He nodded politely, started to walk past, then stopped. "Heard you're running quite an operation now," he said. "It's coming along," Marlene said. "If you ever need financing for expansion, we have programs now." "I know where the bank is," Marlene said. "Thank you." She didn't mean to be cold, but she also didn't need to be warm. That man had been ready to help her liquidate 3 years ago. Now he was ready to lend her money. The difference between those two positions was everything Marlene had done in between, and she'd done it without him. Now, I want to talk about what this story represents in a broader context, because Marlene's approach, cash-flowing growth, aggressive culling, data-driven breeding decisions, became standard practice in dairy management over the next 2 decades. The University of Wisconsin's Dairy Extension Program started teaching these exact principles in the 1970s. What Marlene figured out on her own, out of necessity, became a foundation of modern dairy herd management. The emphasis on individual cow performance, the use of DHI records for culling decisions, the focus on genetics over herd size. These weren't radical ideas, but they weren't common practice in 1965 either. Marlene wasn't inventing anything. She was just paying attention and acting on what the data told her. But in an era when most farmers managed by intuition and tradition, that was revolutionary enough. There's also something worth noting about the community dynamics here. Marlene didn't succeed in spite of her neighbors. She succeeded because of few key people: Clara Bergstrom, the machinery dealer in La Crosse, the AI technician who always showed up on time, the vet who gave her straight answers, helped in small but crucial ways. None of them made a big deal about it. That's not how rural communities work. But that quiet network of support made the difference between possible and impossible. By the autumn of 1968, when Marlene walked into that bank carrying her DHI records in her ledger, she had 46 milking cows, 8 bred heifers coming in over the winter, and 0 debt. Her herd was producing at levels that put her in the top 15% statewide. She'd more than doubled her herd in 3 years without borrowing a cent. The CD she was there to open that day was worth $3,200. Her profit for the first 8 months of a year. The bank teller processed the paperwork, without comment, just another transaction, on a Tuesday morning. Marlene signed where indicated, took her receipt and walked out. Nobody applauded. Nobody wrote a newspaper article. Nobody from the Farm Bureau called to congratulate her. And that was fine. Marlene didn't need acknowledgement. She'd proven what she set out to prove, and she'd proven it to the only person who mattered, herself. She drove home, parked the truck by the barn, and started afternoon milking at 2:30. Same as always. 46 cows, 2 at a time, working steady through the stanchions. By 4:45, she was done. She washed down the pipeline, checked the bulk tank, made notes in her production log. Then she walked to the house, made supper, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the new Wisconsin Agriculture's magazine. There was an article about dairy management and the future of small farms. The author quoted some university researchers saying that farms under 50 cows probably wouldn't survive the next decade. Too small to be efficient. Too big to quit. Marlene read it twice, then set the magazine aside. She'd heard that kind of talk before. She'd heard it in March of 1965, when people said she wouldn't make it 6 months. She'd heard it when she bought those first 4 heifers with money from selling Harold's favorite cow. She'd heard it every time someone asked how she was managing, and the question carried that particular tone, half concern, half certainty that she was about to fold. She'd stopped listening a long time ago. These stories matter because they remind us that the most important work often goes unrecognized. Marlene Gustafson didn't change the world. She changed 46 acres in Vernon County, Wisconsin, and she changed them by doing exactly what needed to be done every day for 3 years straight. No shortcuts, no luck, no miracles. Just competence, stubbornness, and a refusal to accept other people's limitations as her own. If you know someone who'd appreciate this story, someone who remembers when farming was done by hand and by grit and by getting up every morning whether you felt like it or not, share it with them. And if these stories matter to you, subscribe. Every one of these is researched, every detail verified. This is how we keep this history alive. Because people like Marlene Gustafson didn't do what they did for fame. They did it because it needed doing. And we remember them because somebody has to.